I still can't believe how quickly everything I built just disappeared in smoke. The fire didn't just burn my house last weekend, it scorched away all the years I gave away to a family that never truly cared for me. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Eleanor, and at 73 years old, I thought I knew what family meant. I thought I understood the difference between love and obligation. I was wrong about so many things. Every morning for the past 5 years, I've shuffled through my small apartment in Queens, New York. The scent of burnt toast always lingering from my rushed breakfast. The faded photograph of my late husband Robert sitting beside a coffee cup stained with my lipstick marks. Those mornings felt endless. Picking up my granddaughter from school. Driving her to dance class. Grocery shopping for my son Alex and his wife Claire because they were always too busy. Too stressed. Too overwhelmed. My days blurred together like watercolors in the rain. Managing everyone else's chaos while my own life quietly dissolved into invisible service. I tried so hard to patch the growing cracks in my relationship with Claire. She had this way of making me feel like I was always in the way, always asking for too much, even when I was giving everything I had. Last weekend, Claire promised to help me fix the old air conditioner in my basement. It was such a small thing, but I clung to that promise like a lifeline. Maybe we could finally have a moment of peace. Maybe she'd see me as more than just the convenient grandmother who always said yes. Instead, at 3 in the afternoon, my phone rang with the sound that still makes my hands shake. Fire trucks. Sirens blaring outside my building. Neighbors shouting my name from the street below. I ran outside in my slippers and housecoat, my heart hammering against my ribs. Smoke poured from my basement windows like angry gray ghosts escaping into the October sky. Claire stood on the sidewalk, her eyes darting everywhere except to me. Her hands trembled as she spoke. I swear, Eleanor, it was an accident. I was just trying to light the pilot light like you asked. The whole thing just went up so fast. But something in her voice didn't match the panic in her eyes. Something felt rehearsed. Calculated. The smell of smoke clung to her jacket, but underneath it, I caught the unmistakable scent of cigarettes. Claire had quit smoking 2 years ago. Or so she claimed. While everyone gathered around the fire trucks and paramedics checked me for smoke inhalation, I did something I'd never done before. I pulled out my old smartphone and opened the app connected to the security camera I'd installed in my basement 3 months ago. The camera Robert's brother had given me after a string of break-ins in the neighborhood. The camera Claire didn't know existed. What I saw on that small screen changed everything I thought I knew about the woman my son married. What I saw made me question every argument I'd forgiven, every harsh word I'd overlooked, every time I'd made excuses for her behavior toward me. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got here. Let me tell you about the 37 years I spent learning the wrong definition of love. When Alex brought Claire home for the first time in 1986, I wanted so desperately to love her. She was beautiful in that sharp, careful way that made me feel instantly invisible. Her laugh was musical but somehow never included me. She had opinions about everything, my cooking, my decorating, the way I folded Alex's laundry when he still lived at home. I told myself she was just nervous. New to the family. Trying to establish her place. I was 52 then, still vibrant and hopeful. Robert was alive, filling our small house in Astoria with his booming laugh and terrible dad jokes. We had dreams of grandchildren, holiday dinners, the kind of family gatherings you see in movies. When Alex announced their engagement 6 months later, I cried happy tears. I offered to help pay for the wedding, even though money was tight. I offered to sew Claire's dress, to make her grandmother's apple pie recipe for the reception. Each offer was politely declined. I should have seen the pattern starting then. After Robert died in 2003, everything shifted. The house felt too big, too quiet, too full of memories that made my chest ache. Alex suggested I sell it and move closer to them in Queens. "Mom, we want to help you," he said, holding my hands across my kitchen table. "Claire thinks it would be good for you to have family nearby." Claire smiled and nodded, but her eyes were already calculating something I couldn't see yet. I sold the house where I'd raised my children, where Robert and I had slow danced in the kitchen on Saturday mornings. I used half the money to buy my small apartment on 68th Avenue and put the rest in savings. Conservative investments, mostly. Some blue-chip stocks that my late husband had always believed in. Nothing risky. Nothing that would jeopardize my future security. By then, with Robert's life insurance and my modest pension from 30 years of teaching elementary school, I had accumulated what felt like considerable wealth for a widow. Nearly $400,000 in total assets. Not a fortune by New York standards, but enough to ensure I'd never be a burden to anyone. How naive I was to think that wealth would protect me instead of making me a target. The first request came 2 months after I moved to Queens. Alex knocked on my door on a rainy Tuesday evening, his face pale with worry. "Mom, I hate to ask, but Claire's mother is in the hospital. We need $5,000 for her surgery that insurance won't cover." I wrote the check without hesitation. Family takes care of family, right? That's what Robert always said. That's what I believed with every fiber of my being. The second request came 4 months later. Car repairs. $3,000. The third was Claire's sister's wedding gift. $2,000. Then Alex lost his job and needed help with the mortgage. $8,000. Each time, I emptied a little more of my savings account. Each time, I told myself this was what love looked like. This was how mothers showed their devotion. Claire never said thank you directly. The gratitude always came through Alex, secondhand and diluted. "Claire really appreciates this, Mom. You're saving us." But when I'd see her at family dinners, she'd barely make eye contact. She'd talk about their financial struggles as if I weren't sitting right there, as if my contributions were invisible, meaningless. Sometimes she'd even complain about other relatives who were tight with their money or selfish with their inheritances. The irony was lost on her completely, but it cut through me like glass. I started keeping track in a small notebook I hid in my jewelry box. $23,000 over 2 years. Then $38,000. By 2008, I had given them almost $60,000. Each entry in that notebook felt like a tiny betrayal of my own future, but I convinced myself it was an investment in family happiness. I convinced myself that one day, when they were stable and grateful, we'd all laugh about these difficult years over Christmas dinner. Instead, the requests became more frequent, more urgent, always accompanied by elaborate explanations that made me feel guilty for even questioning them. Claire started calling me directly, her voice sweet and manipulative. "Eleanor, you know we wouldn't ask if we weren't desperate." She'd sigh deeply, paint herself as the victim of circumstances beyond her control. "Alex is too proud to ask, but I know you love us enough to help. How do you argue with someone who's made your love the weapon they use against you?" When my granddaughter Emma was born in 2009, I thought everything would change. Holding that tiny, perfect baby in the hospital, I imagined years of bedtime stories, birthday parties, school plays. I imagined the kind of grandmother relationship I'd dreamed of having. Claire seemed softer those first few weeks, exhausted and vulnerable in the way new mothers are. She actually thanked me when I came over every day to help with laundry and cooking. For a brief, shining moment, I thought we'd found our peace. But as Emma grew, I realized I was being positioned as the convenient babysitter rather than the beloved grandmother. Claire worked part-time at a dental office, Alex worked construction, and somehow their schedules always required my immediate availability. I'd get calls at 7 in the morning. "Eleanor, I need you to pick up Emma from daycare and watch her until 8 tonight. Emergency at work." "No please. No thank you." Just expectation wrapped in urgency. I said yes every time because Emma's face lit up when she saw me. Because she'd run to me with her arms wide, calling Grandma Ellie, in that musical voice that made every sacrifice feel worthwhile. I told myself that my relationship with Emma mattered more than my relationship with her parents. I told myself that love sometimes meant accepting less than you deserved. The requests for money didn't stop after Emma was born. They escalated. Baby clothes and equipment they claimed to need but couldn't afford. Medical bills that insurance supposedly wouldn't cover. Car payments when Alex's truck broke down. Always something. Always urgent. Always my responsibility to solve because I was family, because I had the means, because saying no would make me selfish. By 2012, I had given them over $120,000. More than I'd spent on myself in the previous decade. My savings account, once robust enough to ensure a comfortable retirement, had dwindled to less than half its original amount. I started having nightmares about running out of money, about becoming dependent on Alex and Claire for my own survival. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was impoverishing myself to support people who seemed increasingly comfortable with my generosity. But the money was just the beginning of what they took from me. They took my time, my energy, my emotional well-being. Every family gathering became an exercise in walking on eggshells around Claire's moods. If she was having a bad day, everyone had to accommodate her. If she disagreed with something I said, the room would fall silent until I apologized or changed the subject. Alex, my own son, would side with her automatically, even when she was clearly being unfair or unkind. I remember one Thanksgiving when Emma was 5. I'd spent 3 days preparing the entire meal: turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, 3 different pies. Claire arrived 2 hours late with a store-bought dessert, complained that the turkey was too dry, and spent the evening texting on her phone instead of engaging with the family. When I gently suggested we put the phones away for dinner, she snapped at me. Maybe if the conversation was more interesting, I wouldn't need other entertainment. Alex laughed it off. "That's just Claire being Claire, Mom. You know how she is." But Emma saw my face crumble. She climbed into my lap and whispered, "I think your turkey is perfect, Grandma Ellie." That little girl's kindness was often the only bright spot in those increasingly toxic family dinners. The pattern continued for years. Claire would criticize my appearance at family photos. "Maybe you should wear something more flattering, Eleanor." She'd question my parenting advice, even though I'd raised 3 successful children and worked with hundreds of others during my teaching career. "Things are different now. You probably shouldn't fill Emma's head with your old-fashioned ideas." She'd make subtle digs about my age, my relevance, my understanding of modern life. Each comment landed like a small cut, barely noticeable individually but devastating in their accumulation. Alex never defended me. In fact, he seemed to encourage Claire's behavior by laughing along or staying silent when she spoke to me with obvious disrespect. My own son, the boy I'd rocked to sleep through countless nightmares, the teenager I'd driven to baseball practice and cheered for at every game, the young man I'd helped through college and his early career struggles. When it came to choosing between his wife's comfort and his mother's dignity, he chose Claire every single time. I started dreading family events. The anxiety would begin days in advance, a knot in my stomach that grew tighter with each passing hour. I'd rehearse conversations in my mind, trying to predict what might trigger Claire's irritation, what topics might be safe. I'd choose my clothes carefully, knowing she'd find something to criticize. I'd prepare elaborate gifts and meals, hoping to earn a moment of approval that rarely came. The loneliness was crushing. I'd sit in my apartment after these gatherings, replaying every interaction, wondering what I'd done wrong, how I could do better next time. I'd look at photos of Robert and talk to them as if he could hear me. "I don't know how to fix this," I'd whisper to his picture. "I don't know how to make them love me the way I love them." But the worst part wasn't the money or the criticism or even the loneliness. The worst part was how I started to believe their version of me. Maybe I was too needy. Maybe I was out of touch. Maybe I was asking for too much when I wanted basic kindness and respect. Maybe being useful was the best I could hope for, and I should be grateful for even that small role in their lives. I watched other grandmothers at the park with Emma, saw how their adult children hugged them goodbye, how they were included in conversations instead of tolerated on the margins. I felt like an outsider looking in on the kind of family relationships I'd always hoped to have. Other grandmothers talked about vacation trips with their families, holiday traditions that centered around their homes, adult children who called just to chat. I couldn't remember the last time Alex had called me without needing something. The breaking point should have come in 2015 when Claire asked me to take out a loan against my apartment to help them buy a house. Not a small loan. $50,000 that would have put my own housing security at risk. When I hesitated, Alex joined the conversation. "Mom, this is our chance to build equity instead of throwing money away on rent. You'd be investing in our future, in Emma's stability." Claire added her own pressure with tears and emotional manipulation. "I thought family helped family, Eleanor. I thought you wanted what was best for Emma." The implication was clear: if I truly loved my granddaughter, I'd risk my own financial security for their benefit. The guilt was overwhelming. I found myself at the bank, paperwork in hand, ready to sign away my safety net for people who had never shown me genuine gratitude or affection. But something stopped me at the last moment. Maybe it was the bank officer's concerned expression when she reviewed my financial situation. Maybe it was the voice in my head that sounded like Robert, warning me to protect myself. Maybe it was simple self-preservation finally overriding my desperate need for approval. I didn't sign the papers that day. I went home and called Alex to tell him I couldn't do it. The reaction was swift and brutal. Claire didn't speak to me for 3 months. Alex's calls became perfunctory, duty-bound check-ins that felt more like obligations than genuine concern. Even little Emma seemed different, more distant, as if she'd been told things about me that changed how she saw her grandmother. The message was clear: if I wasn't useful, I wasn't welcome. But even that devastating rejection didn't break the cycle completely. I was too afraid of losing them entirely, too convinced that some version of family was better than no family at all. When Claire finally started speaking to me again, I was pathetically grateful. When they needed money for Emma's school activities or medical expenses, I said yes, telling myself these were different, more legitimate requests. I was still teaching myself to be satisfied with crumbs because I was too terrified to demand the whole meal. The worst year was 2018, 3 years before the fire that would change everything. That's when Claire started making comments about my mental state, subtle suggestions that I was becoming forgetful, unreliable, possibly unsafe living alone. Eleanor forgot to lock her door again when she dropped off Emma, she'd tell Alex in front of me. "She seems confused lately. Maybe we should be worried." These observations were always delivered with fake concern, but I recognized the manipulation immediately. She was building a narrative that would justify taking more control over my life and my assets. She started suggesting that I give them power of attorney, just in case something happened. She'd bring up news stories about elderly people being scammed or hurt because they didn't have family oversight. The subtext was terrifying: agree to our control, or we'll convince everyone you're incompetent. I wasn't confused or forgetful. I was depressed and anxious from years of emotional abuse, but my mind was sharp. Sharp enough to see what Claire was doing, even if I felt powerless to stop it. I started keeping detailed calendars, photographing my daily activities, documenting my interactions with them to protect myself against false claims about my mental state. The fact that I felt the need to gather evidence against my own family shows how far our relationship had deteriorated. Alex went along with Claire's concerns, nodding seriously when she'd point out my supposed lapses in judgment. My own son was ready to believe that I'd become incompetent rather than consider that his wife might be manipulating the situation for her own benefit. The betrayal cut deeper than any financial exploitation could. He was prepared to take away my autonomy based on his wife's manufactured evidence. But I held on because of Emma. She was 8 then, old enough to have real conversations, old enough to form lasting memories. When I watched her at school plays or birthday parties, when I taught her to bake Robert's favorite cookies, when she'd fall asleep in my lap during movie nights, I felt like I was creating something worthwhile from the wreckage of my relationship with her parents. I told myself that enduring Claire's abuse was a small price to pay for maintaining my connection to my granddaughter. I didn't realize then that Emma was being taught to see me through her parents' lens. That my relationship with her was being filtered through their resentment and manipulation. Children absorb everything, especially the unspoken tensions and power dynamics between adults. Emma was learning that it was normal to treat elderly family members with casual disrespect, that love was conditional on usefulness, that my primary role was to serve rather than to be cherished. The isolation deepened every year. Old friends from my teaching days had their own families and health issues to manage. Robert's relatives lived too far away for regular contact. My neighbors in Queens were polite but distant, busy with their own lives. The only consistent social interaction I had was with Alex, Claire, and Emma, which meant that my entire emotional well-being depended on people who treated me as an obligation rather than a joy. I started having panic attacks in grocery stores, overwhelmed by simple decisions about what to buy for dinner. I'd sit in my car afterward, crying over nothing and everything, wondering how I'd become so small and helpless and afraid. I'd drive past other families in the park and feel like I was looking at them through glass, unable to access the kind of natural, easy love they seemed to share. The money requests continued, but they'd evolved into something more sinister. Instead of asking for specific amounts for specific purposes, Claire would make vague comments about their financial stress, then wait for me to offer help. "I don't know how we're going to make Emma's tuition payment this semester," she'd sigh during Sunday dinner. "Alex's hours got cut again, and my dental practice is struggling." The expectation was that I'd volunteer to solve their problems without being directly asked, which somehow made me feel even more manipulated and used. By 2019, I had given them over $200,000. More than half of everything Robert and I had saved during 43 years of marriage. My retirement account was nearly empty. My investment portfolio consisted of a few struggling stocks that I was afraid to sell at a loss. The apartment I'd bought with such hope was now mortgaged again to cover their various crises. I was working part-time as a substitute teacher at 70, not because I loved the job, but because I needed the income to survive. But I told myself it was all worth it for Emma's sake. I convinced myself that she needed me, that I was providing her with love and stability that her parents couldn't or wouldn't give her. I didn't see how I was enabling a dysfunctional family system that ultimately hurt everyone involved, including Emma herself. I didn't understand that my martyrdom was teaching her terrible lessons about relationships, boundaries, and self-worth. The beginning of the end started in February of 2021, almost exactly 8 months before the fire. Emma was 11 then, starting to assert her independence in the way that healthy preteens do. She began questioning things she'd previously accepted without argument. Why couldn't she walk to school by herself like other kids her age? Why did her parents always seem stressed about money if Grandma Ellie helped them all the time? Why did her mother talk to me so differently than she talked to other adults? One afternoon when I was driving Emma home from violin lessons, she asked me directly, "Grandma, why does Mom not like you very much?" The question hit me like a physical blow, but it also cracked something open inside me. For the first time, I had to confront the reality that everyone could see what I'd been denying for years. Even a child could recognize the dysfunction that I'd been making excuses for. I gave Emma some gentle, age-appropriate explanation about how adults sometimes disagree or have different personalities. But that night, staring at the ceiling of my bedroom, I couldn't stop thinking about her question. What was I modeling for this little girl about how women should allow themselves to be treated? What was I teaching her about standing up for herself, about demanding respect, about recognizing her own worth? That's when I started making small changes. Nothing dramatic or confrontational, just tiny shifts in how I responded to requests and criticism. When Claire made a snide comment about my appearance, I'd respond neutrally instead of apologizing. When Alex called asking for money, I'd say I needed time to think about it instead of immediately agreeing. When they made last-minute requests for babysitting, I'd occasionally say I had other plans, even if those plans were just staying home and reading a book. The pushback was immediate and intense. Claire accused me of becoming difficult and selfish in my old age. Alex wondered if I was having health problems that were affecting my judgment. They both seemed genuinely shocked that I might have opinions or preferences that didn't revolve around their convenience. The fact that they couldn't conceive of me as a person with my own needs and boundaries showed just how thoroughly they'd been taking advantage of my devotion. But I also started noticing things I'd been blind to before. How Claire would roll her eyes when she thought I wasn't looking. How Alex would cut me off mid-sentence when I was talking, then focus all his attention on his wife. How they'd make plans for holidays and vacations, then inform me of my role in those plans rather than including me in the decision-making process. How they talked about Emma's future as if I wouldn't be part of it, as if my relationship with her was temporary and dispensable. The security camera in my basement was installed in July of 2021. My building had experienced a series of break-ins, and several residents had invested in various security measures. I bought the cheapest system I could find online, mainly to satisfy my insurance company's requirements. The camera was small and basic, designed to send alerts to my phone if it detected motion in the basement. I mentioned it to Alex when he helped me install it, but I doubt he told Claire about it. It seemed like such an insignificant detail at the time. I had no idea that tiny camera would eventually save me from being destroyed completely. The autumn of 2021 was particularly difficult. Claire's demands had become more brazen and frequent. She'd started making comments about my apartment, suggesting that it was too big for someone my age, that I should consider downsizing to something more manageable. The subtext was always the same: I should sell my home and give them access to the proceeds. When I didn't respond positively to these suggestions, she'd pivot to concerns about my safety and independence. "Eleanor, what if you fell and no one found you for days?" she'd say with fake worry. "What if you had a stroke or a heart attack? At your age, living alone just seems so risky." Alex would nod along, adding his own observations about my supposed frailty and confusion. They were building a case for why I needed their oversight and control, why it would be better for everyone if I became financially dependent on them. But I wasn't frail or confused. I was tired and sad and increasingly angry. I was tired of pretending that their treatment of me was acceptable. I was sad about the family relationships I'd hoped for but would never have. And yes, I was getting angry about the years I'd wasted, the money I'd given, the respect I'd never received in return. My old friend Margaret, whom I'd reconnected with through Facebook, started noticing changes in my voice during our phone calls. "Eleanor, you sound different," she'd say. "You sound defeated. What's happening with your family?" Margaret lived in Florida now, retired and happy, surrounded by friends and activities that brought her joy. Talking to her reminded me that there were other ways to live, other definitions of fulfillment and purpose. Through Margaret, I started attending virtual support groups for seniors dealing with family conflicts. I learned terms like financial abuse and emotional manipulation. I heard stories from other women who'd given away their security and dignity to adult children who treated them like ATMs rather than beloved parents. For the first time, I realized I wasn't alone in this experience. I wasn't uniquely defective or unlovable. I was trapped in a pattern that destroys thousands of families every year. But knowledge and change are two different things. Even as I began to understand what was happening to me, I felt powerless to stop it. The thought of confronting Alex and Claire directly filled me with terror. What if they cut me off from Emma completely? What if they turned her against me with lies and manipulation? What if I ended up completely alone, with no family at all? These fears kept me paralyzed through the winter and into the spring of 2021. I continued to give them money, continued to provide free childcare, continued to accept disrespect and neglect as the price of maintaining some version of family connection. But something fundamental had shifted inside me. I was no longer a willing victim. I was a woman planning her escape, even if I didn't know it yet. The events of that terrible weekend in October started on Friday morning with a phone call from Claire. She was using her sweetest, most manipulative voice, the one that always preceded a significant request. "Eleanor, I hate to ask, but we have an emergency. Alex's truck needs major repairs, and we don't have the money right now. Could you help us out? Just temporarily, until his next paycheck." I asked how much they needed. $3,000. I asked when they'd be able to pay me back. "Soon," she said vaguely. "You know we're good for it." But I'd been keeping careful records now, and they'd never paid me back for anything. Not once in over 15 years of requests had they returned money they'd borrowed. The word loan was meaningless in our relationship. Every dollar I gave them was gone forever. For the first time, I didn't immediately agree. "Let me think about it," I said. "I'll call you back tomorrow." The silence on the other end of the phone was profound. Claire had never heard me hesitate before. When she finally spoke again, her voice had lost all its artificial sweetness. "Fine," she said coldly. "But don't wait too long. We need to get this fixed by Monday." That night, I lay awake reviewing my financial situation. After all the money I'd given them over the years, my total assets had shrunk to less than $200,000. That might sound like a lot to some people, but at 73, with rising healthcare costs and inflation eating away at my fixed income, it wasn't enough to ensure a secure future. If I kept giving them money at this rate, I'd be impoverished within a few years, completely dependent on them for my survival. The irony was bitter and sharp. I'd been trying so hard to buy their love that I was creating the exact situation they wanted, my total dependence on their goodwill. Once I had no money left, once I needed their help instead of providing it, what would happen to me then? Would they care for me with the same devotion I'd shown them? The evidence suggested otherwise. Saturday morning, I called Claire back. "I can't give you the money," I said simply. "I'm sorry, but I need to be more careful with my finances." The explosion was immediate and vicious. She accused me of being selfish, of not caring about Alex's ability to work, of putting my own comfort ahead of the family's needs. When Alex got on the phone, he was equally furious, though his anger felt more disappointed than cruel. "Mom, I'm shocked," he said. "This isn't like you. Claire's right, you're being selfish. We've never asked you for anything we didn't desperately need." The gaslighting was so complete, so audacious, that I almost laughed. They'd taken over $200,000 from me and were calling me selfish for finally saying no to one request. But I held firm. "I can't do it this time," I repeated. "You'll have to find another solution." Alex hung up without saying goodbye. Claire sent me a series of text messages throughout the day, alternating between guilt-tripping manipulation and outright threats. "Fine, Eleanor. I guess we know where we stand with you now. Don't expect us to be there for you when you need help." That threat should have frightened me. Instead, it gave me a moment of clarity. When had they ever been there for me? When had they offered comfort when I was sick, support when I was sad, companionship when I was lonely? I'd been giving and giving and giving for years, and they'd been taking it all while providing nothing in return except criticism and conditional tolerance. Sunday was the day Claire offered to help with my air conditioning. The basement unit had been making strange noises for weeks, and I'd mentioned it during one of our phone conversations. When she called Sunday morning suggesting she come over to look at it, I was surprised but pleased. Maybe my refusal to give them money had prompted some self-reflection. Maybe she wanted to repair our relationship by offering practical help instead of just requesting financial assistance. I should have known better. I should have recognized that Claire had never performed any act of genuine service in all the years I'd known her. I should have wondered why she was suddenly interested in helping me with anything. But I was so desperate for any sign of care or consideration that I ignored every red flag my instincts were raising. She arrived at my apartment around lunchtime, carrying a small toolbox and wearing clothes that seemed too nice for basement repair work. Her manner was strange, distracted, as if her mind was somewhere else entirely. We made awkward small talk while I showed her down to the basement, pointing out the air conditioning unit that had been giving me trouble. "I'll need to light the pilot light," she said, though that didn't make sense for an electric air conditioning system. "Do you have matches or a lighter?" I found an old lighter in my junk drawer and handed it to her, already feeling uneasy about the whole situation. "Why don't you go back upstairs?" she suggested. "This might take a while, and the basement gets pretty stuffy." I went upstairs but felt too anxious to settle into any activity. Something about Claire's behavior had set my nerves on edge. After about 20 minutes, I heard what sounded like a door closing too hard, followed by Claire's footsteps on the basement stairs. "All done," she called up to me. "It should work fine now." But when I asked what the problem had been, her explanation was vague and technical sounding without actually making any sense. She left quickly after that, claiming she had other errands to run. I went back down to the basement to check on the air conditioning unit, and that's when I noticed the smell. Not just the mustiness that always lingered in old basements, but something else. Something that reminded me of cigarettes, though I couldn't figure out why. The air conditioning unit seemed fine, running quietly and efficiently. Whatever Claire had done appeared to have worked. I should have trusted my instincts about that smell. I should have investigated more thoroughly. I should have checked the security camera footage immediately instead of waiting until after the fire to discover the truth. But I was so relieved that Claire had actually helped me with something, so hopeful that we might be turning a corner in our relationship, that I dismissed my own concerns as paranoia. That night, I went to bed feeling more optimistic than I had in months. Maybe saying no to their money request hadn't destroyed our relationship after all. Maybe Claire's offer to help with the air conditioning was a sign that she was ready to build a different kind of relationship with me, one based on mutual respect rather than financial exploitation. I fell asleep planning ways to nurture this potential breakthrough, imagining family dinners where we actually enjoyed each other's company. I woke up 3 hours later to the sound of sirens. The phone call came at 2:30 in the morning. A neighbor from downstairs, screaming that smoke was pouring from my basement windows and that fire trucks were on their way. I threw on my robe and slippers and ran outside, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might collapse. Half my building was awake, neighbors standing in the street pointing at the gray smoke billowing from the basement level. The fire department arrived within minutes, but those minutes felt like hours. I watched them break down my basement door, watched them drag out my water heater and furnace, watched them soak everything I owned with their hoses. The damage wasn't catastrophic, they'd caught it before it spread to the main floors, but it was devastating enough. Everything in my basement was ruined. The foundation was scorched and cracked. The repairs would cost thousands of dollars and take months to complete. Claire arrived while the firefighters were still working. She appeared at my elbow as I stood shivering on the sidewalk, her face arranged in an expression of shock and concern. "Oh my God, Eleanor," she said, reaching for my arm. "I can't believe this happened. Thank goodness you're okay. I was here just this afternoon helping with your air conditioning. This is such a terrible coincidence." But something in her voice again struck me as wrong. Too practiced. Too prepared. And underneath the smell of smoke and water damage, I caught that same cigarette scent I'd noticed in my basement earlier. Claire claimed she'd quit smoking years ago, but clearly, that wasn't true. When I looked at her more closely, her hands were shaking, and her eyes couldn't meet mine directly. "I swear, Eleanor, this is such a shock," she kept repeating. "I can't imagine how this could have happened. It's such strange timing, right after I was working down there." The more she talked, the more forced her concern sounded. She was protesting too much, explaining too many things that didn't need explanation unless you were trying to cover up something. Alex arrived 20 minutes later, still in his pajamas, looking genuinely shocked and worried. His reaction seemed authentic in a way that Claire's didn't. He held me while I cried, promised to help with insurance claims and repair work, asked practical questions about where I'd stay while the damage was being assessed. For a moment, I felt like I had my son back, the caring man I'd raised before his wife had turned him against me. But even Alex's kindness felt conditional. As we talked about next steps, he kept suggesting that this might be a sign that I should consider other living arrangements. Maybe it was time to think about senior housing, someplace where I'd have more support and wouldn't have to worry about home maintenance issues. Maybe this fire was a blessing in disguise that would force me to make healthier choices about my living situation. I realized that both of them saw this disaster as an opportunity. Claire saw it as potential cover for whatever she'd actually been doing in my basement. Alex saw it as justification for pressuring me to sell my apartment and move somewhere they could have more control over my daily life. Neither of them seemed primarily concerned with my emotional trauma or my genuine needs in this crisis. The insurance adjuster came the next day and confirmed that the fire had started near my furnace but couldn't determine the exact cause. Electrical issues, maybe, or something related to the pilot light. The investigation was cursory, focused more on assessing damage than determining fault. Without clear evidence of arson or negligence, they were treating it as an unfortunate accident that my homeowner's insurance would have to cover. But I kept thinking about that cigarette smell, about Claire's strange behavior, about the timing of everything. When I mentioned my concerns to Alex, he dismissed them immediately. "Mom, you're looking for someone to blame because you're upset and scared. Claire would never do anything to hurt you. She was trying to help you." His certainty was absolute and infuriating. He couldn't even consider the possibility that his wife might have lied to him or manipulated the situation. That's when I remembered the security camera. I'd been so overwhelmed by the fire and its aftermath that I'd completely forgotten about the little camera I'd installed in my basement months earlier. My hands were shaking as I opened the app on my phone, scrolling back through the footage to Sunday afternoon. What I saw on that small screen changed everything I thought I knew about the woman my son had married. The footage was grainy but clear enough to see the important details. Claire descended into my basement carrying the toolbox she'd brought, but she also had something else in her hand. A cigarette. She lit it immediately upon reaching the basement, taking several deep drags while she examined my furnace and air conditioning unit. She wasn't trying to fix anything. She was looking for something flammable, something that would catch fire easily and spread quickly. She found what she was looking for in a box of old Christmas decorations I'd stored near the furnace. Paper ornaments, dried wreaths, strings of lights with frayed cords. She pulled several items out of the box and arranged them near the furnace, creating what looked like an accidental pile of kindling. Then she took one last drag of her cigarette and flicked it directly into the pile. The initial flame was small, barely visible on the camera. Claire stood watching for several seconds, as if she was waiting to make sure the fire would catch and spread. Then she quickly gathered her tools and headed for the stairs, but not before stopping to take something else from the storage area. She picked up a small gasoline can that I kept for my old lawnmower and tipped it over, spilling its contents near the base of the furnace. The timestamp showed that she'd been in my basement for less than 10 minutes. She'd come to my apartment with a plan to burn it down, and she'd executed that plan with cold, calculated precision. This wasn't an accident or a moment of recklessness. This was attempted arson, deliberate and premeditated. I watched the footage 3 times, each viewing making me feel sicker and more betrayed. Claire had tried to destroy my home, my security, my entire life. If the flames had spread faster, if my neighbors hadn't noticed the smoke so quickly, I could have died in the fire she'd set. She'd been willing to risk my life to achieve whatever goal she'd been pursuing. But what was her goal? Insurance money? Forcing me to move in with them where they could control my finances more directly? Creating a crisis that would make me more dependent on their help and support? I couldn't understand the specific motivation, but the malicious intent was undeniable. The woman I'd been trying so hard to love and appease for over 15 years had just tried to burn down my home. I saved the footage to multiple devices and cloud storage accounts, making sure it couldn't be accidentally deleted or lost. This was evidence of a serious crime, proof that my worst suspicions about Claire had been not nearly suspicious enough. But even with this devastating confirmation of her betrayal, I felt paralyzed about what to do next. If I went to the police, Claire would be arrested. Alex would never forgive me for destroying his marriage and potentially sending his wife to prison. Emma would lose her mother and gain a grandmother who'd torn her family apart. I'd finally have justice, but at the cost of losing what little connection I still had with my son and granddaughter. If I confronted Claire directly, she'd deny everything and probably convince Alex that I was having mental health issues, that I was so desperate to blame someone for the fire that I was manufacturing evidence against her. She was already skilled at manipulating situations to make me look unreasonable or unstable. Adding paranoid accusations to the mix would only strengthen her position. But I couldn't just pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen. I couldn't continue to accept Claire's fake concern and hollow apologies, knowing that she'd been ready to kill me to achieve her goals. Something had to change, even if I wasn't sure yet what that change would look like. I started by creating distance. When Alex called to check on me and discuss temporary housing while my apartment was being repaired, I told him I'd already made arrangements to stay with a friend. It was a lie. I was staying in a hotel and couldn't afford to do so for very long, but I needed space to think without their constant input and pressure. When Claire sent text messages offering to help with insurance claims or cleanup, I responded briefly and politely without accepting any assistance. I could see through her offers now, recognizing them as attempts to stay involved in the process and control the narrative about what had happened. Every expression of concern felt like another manipulation, another lie designed to cover up her crime. The insurance settlement took 6 weeks to process, which gave me time to plan my next moves. I used some of the hotel stay thinking about what I really wanted from life, what kind of relationships were worth preserving, and what boundaries I needed to establish to protect myself from further abuse. For the first time in years, my thoughts were focused on my own needs instead of other people's expectations. I also started seeing a therapist who specialized in family trauma and elder abuse. Dr. Martinez was a warm, direct woman in her 50s who helped me understand that what I'd been experiencing wasn't normal family conflict. It was systematic emotional and financial abuse designed to break down my sense of self-worth and independence. She helped me see that my desperate attempts to earn Claire's approval had actually enabled her worst behaviors toward me. "Eleanor," she said during one of our sessions, "you've been teaching them that you'll accept any treatment as long as they don't abandon you completely. But what you're getting from them isn't love or family connection. It's exploitation with just enough positive reinforcement to keep you hooked." Her words were harsh but liberating. I'd been addicted to crumbs of approval from people who fundamentally didn't respect or care about me. Through therapy, I began to understand that confronting Claire about the fire footage was less important than establishing and maintaining boundaries going forward. Whether she faced legal consequences for her actions mattered less than whether I could build a life that didn't revolve around managing other people's emotions and demands. I needed to focus on my own recovery and growth, not on punishing her for years of abuse. But I also knew I couldn't continue to pretend that everything was normal between us. The insurance money had covered most of my apartment repairs, but I wasn't ready to move back home yet. The building felt tainted now, associated with Claire's betrayal and the months of stress that had preceded the fire. I needed a fresh start somewhere she couldn't find me or manipulate situations to her advantage. That's when I made the first truly independent decision I'd made in years. I put my Queens apartment on the market and started looking for a new place to live. Somewhere smaller and more manageable, but also somewhere that felt like mine rather than an extension of my dysfunctional family relationships. I wanted to wake up in the morning excited about my day instead of anxious about who might call with a crisis or criticism. Alex was shocked when I told him about my decision to sell the apartment. "Mom, this is such a huge step. Are you sure you're thinking clearly? Maybe you should wait until you've had more time to process everything that happened." His concern felt genuine, but it was also patronizing. At 73, after raising 3 children and working for 30 years and surviving my husband's death and managing my own finances successfully for 2 decades, I was perfectly capable of making decisions about where to live. Claire's reaction was more calculating. She immediately started asking questions about my plans, where I was thinking of moving, what I intended to do with the proceeds from the apartment sale. I could see her mental wheels turning as she tried to figure out how this change might affect her access to my resources. She even offered to help me look at new places, which would have given her inside information about my finances and future plans. I declined all their offers of assistance and made it clear that I preferred to handle the moving process independently. This was my chance to break free from their constant involvement in my decisions, and I wasn't going to waste it by accepting help that came with strings attached. For the first time in my adult life, I was going to choose where to live based solely on what would make me happy and comfortable. The apartment sold quickly, for more than I'd expected. The New York real estate market was strong, and my building was well maintained despite the basement fire. After paying off the small remaining mortgage and covering realtor fees and taxes, I had enough money to buy a smaller place outright and still have a substantial amount left over for living expenses and emergencies. I found a perfect 1-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side, in a building with a doorman and excellent security. It was bright and quiet, with a view of a small park where I could watch children play and dog owners gather in the early mornings. The building had a community room where residents could host small gatherings, a library where I could read without interruption, and a rooftop garden where I could grow herbs and flowers. Most importantly, it felt safe. Not just physically secure, but emotionally protected from the chaos and manipulation that had defined my life in Queens. I could imagine waking up there without immediately wondering what crisis or conflict the day would bring. I could imagine inviting friends over without worrying about what Claire might say about my hosting abilities or decorating choices. The day I signed the lease, I felt lighter than I had in years. I was taking control of my living situation, my financial future, and my emotional well-being all at once. This apartment would be truly mine, not a place where I waited for other people to visit or call, but a home where I could build the kind of life I actually wanted to live. I moved in during the first week of December, 2021. Alex helped me with some of the heavier furniture, and I was grateful for his assistance, but I could tell he was troubled by the changes he saw in me. I was calmer but also more distant. Polite but not eager to please. Independent in a way that probably seemed unfamiliar and possibly threatens to his understanding of our relationship. Claire came by once during the moving process, ostensibly to help but actually to assess my new living situation. She made comments about the building's expensive appearance, the doorman, the generally upscale neighborhood. "This must be costing you a fortune, Eleanor. Are you sure you can afford to live here long term?" Her concern was transparently fake, motivated by worry that my housing costs might reduce the amount of money available for future family emergencies. I assured her that I'd planned carefully and could afford my new lifestyle comfortably. I didn't mention that living alone in a smaller space was actually less expensive than maintaining the larger Queens apartment, even with the higher rent. I didn't explain my financial situation in any detail, which seemed to frustrate her immensely. She was used to knowing everything about my income and expenses, information she'd used to calculate how much she could safely request during various crises. Christmas of 2021 was the first holiday in years where I felt genuinely peaceful. I decorated my new apartment with lights and a small tree, cooked myself a perfect dinner for one, and spent the evening reading by the window while snow fell softly outside. Alex, Claire, and Emma were spending the holiday with Claire's family in New Jersey, which meant I had complete freedom to celebrate however I chose. I didn't feel lonely or abandoned as I'd expected. Instead, I felt relieved. No walking on eggshells around Claire's moods. No preparing elaborate meals that would be criticized or ignored. No expensive gifts that would be received without gratitude or acknowledgement. Just quiet, simple pleasure in my own company and my own traditions. Emma called me that evening to wish me Merry Christmas, and we had a lovely conversation about her school activities and friends. But I could hear Claire's voice in the background, interrupting occasionally with reminders about time limits or other relatives who were waiting to use the phone. Even a simple conversation between a grandmother and granddaughter had to be managed and controlled by Claire, as if my relationship with Emma was too dangerous to be left unsupervised. That phone call crystallized something I'd been trying to avoid acknowledging. My relationship with Emma, the one connection I'd thought was pure and worth preserving at any cost, was entirely mediated through her parents. I had no independent relationship with my granddaughter, no way to maintain a connection with her if Alex and Claire decided to cut me off completely. I'd been so afraid of losing access to Emma that I'd never noticed how little access I actually had. This realization was devastating but also liberating. I'd been enduring years of abuse partly because I thought I was protecting my relationship with Emma. But that relationship was already constrained and artificial, filtered through two people who clearly resented my presence in their lives. I couldn't save Emma from her parents' dysfunction by allowing myself to be destroyed by it. I could only model healthy boundaries and hope that someday she'd recognize the difference between love and manipulation. The new year brought unexpected clarity and energy. In January, I enrolled in a photography class at a community arts center in Harlem. I'd always loved taking pictures but had never studied the technical aspects of composition and lighting. The class was full of interesting people from all different backgrounds and ages, united by curiosity about visual storytelling. For the first time in years, I was spending time with people who knew me only as Eleanor, the woman learning to use manual camera settings and experimenting with black and white portraits. They didn't know about my family drama or financial history. They weren't evaluating me based on my usefulness or my willingness to solve their problems. I was just another student, struggling with f-stops and shutter speeds like everyone else. My instructor, Carlos, was a patient man in his 40s who made art seem accessible and joyful rather than intimidating. He encouraged us to photograph whatever moved us, whether that was architecture or street scenes or abstract compositions. The best photographs come from authentic emotion, he'd say. Don't worry about impressing anyone. Just show us what you see. I started carrying my camera everywhere, documenting the small moments that brought me pleasure. The way morning light fell across my kitchen table. The patterned shadows made on sidewalks. The faces of strangers reading books in coffee shops. Through the camera lens, I began to see my own life as interesting and valuable rather than just a series of obligations and disappointments. Alex called occasionally during this period, conversations that felt stilted and careful. He'd ask about my health, my adjustment to the new apartment, my financial situation. I'd answer politely but without the detailed information he seemed to be seeking. Our relationship felt like it was being renegotiated, both of us uncertain about what roles we should play now that I was no longer the family's automatic source of emergency funding and unlimited support. Claire rarely called directly, but I could sense her influence in Alex's questions about my activities and spending habits. She wanted to know if I was making friends in my new building, if I was taking care of myself properly, if I needed any help with household maintenance or bill paying. The subtext was always the same: was I becoming vulnerable in any way that might create opportunities for them to reinsert themselves into my daily life? But I was becoming stronger and more independent every week. The photography classes led to friendships with classmates who shared my interests. The building's community room hosted monthly social events where I met neighbors who were intelligent, accomplished people with rich lives and engaging stories. My therapist helped me continue processing years of trauma while building skills for healthier relationships in the future. For the first time in decades, I was building a social network based on mutual enjoyment rather than family obligation. These new friends genuinely liked spending time with me. They asked for my opinions, remembered details about my life, included me in plans because they wanted my company rather than my services. The contrast with my family relationships was stark and painful but also validating. Spring arrived early that year, and I started spending more time in the rooftop garden, learning to grow herbs and vegetables in containers. My neighbor Mrs. Patel, a retired teacher from India, became my gardening mentor and eventually one of my closest friends. She was a widow too, but she'd managed to maintain loving relationships with her adult children while still preserving her independence and dignity. "Eleanor," she said one afternoon as we watered our tomato plants together, "your family doesn't define your worth. You are not responsible for managing other people's emotions or solving other people's problems. You raised your children and gave them the tools they need to build their own lives. Your job now is to live your own life as fully as possible." Her words were simple but revolutionary to someone who'd spent years believing that good mothers sacrificed everything for their families, no matter how unappreciated or abused they became in the process. Mrs. Patel showed me what healthy family relationships looked like: regular contact without constant crisis, affection without obligation, support that flowed both ways rather than only from parent to child. By summer, I realized I was genuinely happy for the first time in years. Not just content or peaceful, but actively excited about my days, curious about new experiences, grateful for the friendships I'd built and the freedom I'd created. I was eating better, sleeping better, laughing more, worrying less. The constant anxiety that had defined my previous years had lifted like fog burning off in bright sunlight. Alex noticed the changes when he came to visit in July. I'd invited him for dinner in my apartment, the first time I'd hosted him since moving, and he seemed surprised by my visible contentment. "Mom, you seem different," he said. "More relaxed." less worried about everything. I took it as a compliment, though I wasn't sure he meant it as one. During that dinner, I made a decision that surprised both of us. When Alex mentioned that they were struggling with Emma's summer camp fees, I didn't immediately offer to help. Instead, I asked questions about their budget, their priorities, their plans for managing their finances more effectively. I suggested resources for financial planning and debt management rather than reaching for my checkbook. Alex was clearly uncomfortable with this new dynamic. He'd expected our conversation to follow the familiar pattern. He'd mention a financial problem, I'd solve it with money, and we'd both feel satisfied with our roles in the transaction. My refusal to play that game anymore forced him to confront the reality of their financial dependence on me and to consider other solutions to their problems. "Mom, I thought you might want to help with Emma's camp," he said finally. "She's really excited about it, and we can't afford it on our own." The guilt trip was gentle but persistent, designed to make me feel responsible for Emma's disappointment if I didn't provide funding. I responded with something I'd never said before: "Alex, Emma's activities are your and Claire's responsibility. I'm not her parent, and I can't keep subsidizing your family's lifestyle. You need to make choices based on what you can afford, not what you hope I'll pay for." The words felt foreign in my mouth but also strong and clear. The conversation that followed was difficult but necessary. Alex accused me of becoming selfish in my old age, of caring more about my own comfort than my family's needs. I explained that I'd given them hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years and had received very little appreciation or affection in return. He seemed genuinely shocked by the total amount, as if he'd never calculated the cumulative cost of all those individual requests. "Mom, we never asked you for money you couldn't afford to give," he said defensively. But that wasn't true, and we both knew it. They'd asked for money I needed for my own security and future, money I could only spare by sacrificing my own comfort and stability. They'd been comfortable with my sacrifices as long as I made them willingly and without complaint. That dinner ended awkwardly, with Alex leaving earlier than planned and both of us uncertain about what our relationship would look like going forward. But I felt proud of myself for speaking honestly about our financial dynamic instead of pretending it was healthy or sustainable. For the first time, I'd prioritized my own needs over his immediate comfort, and the sky hadn't fallen. Claire's reaction to my new boundaries was more vindictive than Alex's disappointment. She started making subtle comments to Emma about how I'd changed, how I seemed less interested in being part of the family, how my new lifestyle was making me forget what was important. When Emma repeated some of these comments during our phone conversations, I realized that Claire was trying to poison my relationship with my granddaughter as punishment for my financial independence. The final confrontation came in September, almost exactly 1 year after the fire. Alex called to request money for Emma's school supplies and fall activities, a conversation that felt like a test of whether my new boundaries were permanent or temporary. When I politely declined to help, he became more aggressive than I'd ever seen him. "Mom, what's happened to you?" he demanded. "You used to care about our family. You used to want to help us when we needed it. Now you're living in some fancy apartment acting like you're too good for us." His words were designed to shame me back into compliance, to make me feel guilty for choosing my own financial security over their convenience. But instead of feeling guilty, I felt angry. Angrier than I'd been in years, maybe in my entire life. "Alex," I said, my voice steady and cold, "I've given you over $200,000 in the past 15 years. I've provided free childcare, emotional support, and financial assistance whenever you asked. I've accepted disrespect and manipulation from your wife without complaint. I've prioritized your family's needs over my own security and happiness for years. And you're calling me selfish for finally saying no to one request?" The silence on the other end of the phone was profound. Alex had never heard me speak to him with such directness, such clarity about our relationship dynamic. I could practically hear him trying to process the idea that I might have legitimate grievances against him and Claire, that my new boundaries might be justified rather than arbitrary. "Furthermore," I continued, "I have security camera footage of Claire deliberately setting fire to my basement. She came to my apartment with a plan to burn it down, and she executed that plan with complete disregard for my safety. I have evidence of attempted arson, and I've been debating whether to take it to the police." This revelation seemed to stun Alex into complete silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was small and confused. "Mom, that's impossible. Claire would never do something like that. You must be mistaken about what you saw." But his certainty was cracking. I could hear doubt creeping into his voice as he tried to process this information. I offered to show him the footage, to let him see with his own eyes what his wife had done to me. "Come to my apartment tomorrow evening," I said. "Bring Claire if you want. It's time we all saw the truth about what happened that night." We arranged to meet at 7 o'clock, and I spent the rest of that day preparing for the most difficult conversation of my life. The next evening, Alex arrived alone. Claire had refused to come, claiming she had other commitments, but I suspected she knew what I'd discovered and was afraid to face the evidence. Alex looked nervous and defensive, clearly hoping to convince me that whatever I thought I'd seen was the product of confusion or malicious interpretation. I had prepared carefully for this meeting. The video footage was ready to play on my laptop, saved in multiple formats to prevent any technical difficulties. I'd also printed out financial records showing every payment I'd made to them over the years, organized chronologically to demonstrate the pattern of requests and my consistent compliance. I wanted Alex to see not just the crime Claire had committed, but the context of abuse and exploitation that had led up to it. We sat at my kitchen table, the laptop between us, and I started the video. Alex watched in stunned silence as his wife descended into my basement with a cigarette in her hand, deliberately arranged flammable materials near my furnace, flicked the cigarette into the pile, and spilled gasoline to accelerate the fire. The evidence was indisputable and devastating. When the video ended, Alex sat in silence for several long minutes. I could see him trying to process what he'd witnessed, trying to reconcile this evidence of Claire's malicious intent with his image of her as his loving wife and Emma's devoted mother. The cognitive dissonance was clearly painful for him. "Mom," he said finally, "I don't understand why she would do this. What was she trying to accomplish?" His voice was broken, confused, as if he were seeing his wife clearly for the first time in their 20-year relationship. I showed him the financial records then, helping him understand the broader pattern of exploitation that had made me vulnerable to Claire's escalating abuse. I explained how her demands for money had increased over the years, how she'd tried to gain control over my finances, how she'd built a narrative about my supposed mental decline to justify taking over my affairs. The fire, I suggested, might have been intended to force me to move in with them, where they could have complete access to my remaining assets. Alex reviewed the financial records with growing horror. Seeing the total amount of money they'd taken from me, seeing how relentlessly they'd requested assistance without ever offering anything in return, seemed to shock him into recognition of how abusive their treatment had been. "Mom, I had no idea it added up to so much," he whispered. "I thought these were just occasional emergencies, not a constant pattern." But even faced with overwhelming evidence of his wife's cruelty and his own complicity in my financial exploitation, Alex couldn't bring himself to take decisive action. He asked me not to go to the police, claiming it would destroy Emma's family and traumatize her unnecessarily. He promised to confront Claire about the fire, to demand that she apologize and change her behavior toward me. He suggested family counseling as if therapy could somehow undo years of deliberate abuse. I listened to his requests with compassion but also with clear-eyed understanding of what he was really asking. He wanted me to continue protecting him and Claire from the consequences of their actions. He wanted me to prioritize their comfort over my own justice, their reputation over my own safety. Even now, even with undeniable proof of attempted arson and systematic exploitation, he expected me to sacrifice my own interests for theirs. "Alex," I said gently but firmly, "I'm not going to the police because I've decided to focus on my own healing rather than their punishment. But I'm also not going to pretend this didn't happen or continue to maintain a relationship that's been harmful to me for years. This is where our story ends. I wish you and Emma well, but I can't have you and Claire in my life anymore." The finality of my decision seemed to shock Alex more than the evidence of his wife's crime had. He'd expected that once I'd expressed my anger and shown him the proof of their wrongdoing, we'd find a way to repair our relationship and return to some version of normal family functioning. The possibility that I might choose to cut contact entirely had apparently never occurred to him. He pleaded with me for over an hour, alternating between apologies, promises of change, and subtle threats about what I'd lose if I insisted on ending our relationship. He reminded me that Emma loved me, that I'd regret missing her childhood and adolescence, that family was supposed to forgive each other's mistakes. He painted my decision as vindictive and extreme, as if protecting myself from further abuse was somehow equivalent to the abuse I'd endured. But my resolve had been building for months, strengthened by therapy and healthy friendships and the daily experience of living without constant conflict and manipulation. I wasn't making this decision in a moment of anger or hurt. I was making it from a place of clarity about what kind of life I wanted to live and what kinds of relationships were worth preserving. "I will always love you, Alex," I told him as he prepared to leave. "But I won't continue to accept treatment that damages my well-being and security. If you ever develop the capacity for genuine accountability and change, my door will be open. Until then, I need to protect myself from further harm." It was one of the hardest things I'd ever said, but also one of the most necessary. After Alex left that night, I felt strangely peaceful. The confrontation I'd been dreading for months was finally over. I'd spoken my truth clearly and completely, without anger or retaliation but also without compromise or accommodation. I'd offered Alex a path back to relationship with me, but only on terms that required him to acknowledge the harm he'd participated in and take concrete steps to change his behavior. I knew he probably wouldn't take that path. Change is difficult for everyone, but especially difficult for people who benefit from dysfunctional systems. Alex would probably convince himself that I was being unreasonable, that Claire's crime wasn't as serious as I'd made it seem, that my decision to end contact was proof of my own instability rather than a healthy response to years of abuse. Claire's reaction, when it came, was predictably vindictive. She sent me a series of text messages over the following days, alternating between fake apologies and subtle threats. She claimed the fire had been a genuine accident, that the video footage was being misinterpreted, that my decision to end our relationship was hurting Emma more than anyone else. When I didn't respond to her messages, she escalated to social media, posting vague references to family members who abandon you when you need them most and elderly people who lose perspective on what's important. These public attempts at manipulation might have worked on the old version of me, the woman who prioritized family harmony over her own dignity. But the new version of me, the version who'd been strengthened by therapy and genuine friendships, could see Claire's behavior for what it was, a desperate attempt to regain control over someone who'd finally escaped her influence. I blocked Claire's phone number and social media accounts, cutting off her access to me entirely. I changed my home phone number and made sure the building's doorman knew not to allow her access to my apartment. I created clear, concrete boundaries to protect myself from further harassment or manipulation, boundaries I was prepared to enforce with legal action if necessary. The hardest part of ending contact with Alex and Claire was losing my relationship with Emma. I'd known this would be a consequence of my decision, but actually living with the loss of my granddaughter's presence in my life was more painful than I'd anticipated. I found myself missing our phone conversations, wondering about her school activities and friendships, hoping she was developing into the strong, independent young woman she had the potential to become. But I also knew that my relationship with Emma had never been as authentic or independent as I'd believed. Every interaction we'd had was mediated through her parents, subject to their approval and control. I'd never been allowed to develop a genuine bond with her based on our shared interests and affection. Instead, I'd been positioned as the convenient grandmother who provided services and resources while being careful not to interfere with her parents' authority. Losing that constrained, artificial relationship was painful, but it was also liberating. I no longer had to walk on eggshells around Claire's jealousy and control issues. I no longer had to worry about how my words or actions might be interpreted or reported back to parents who saw me as a threat rather than a resource. I could grieve the relationship I'd hoped to have with Emma while also acknowledging that it had never really existed in the first place. Fall turned into winter, and my new life continued to evolve and deepen. The photography classes led to a small group of enthusiasts who met regularly to share their work and explore different neighborhoods together. Mrs. Patel and I became even closer friends, cooking together and attending cultural events throughout the city. My therapist helped me continue processing the complex grief that comes with choosing to end toxic family relationships. I also started volunteering at a local senior center, helping other older adults who were dealing with financial exploitation and family abuse. My own experience, as painful as it had been, gave me credibility and insight that made me effective at helping others recognize and escape similar situations. There's something profound about using your own suffering to prevent others from experiencing the same harm. The volunteer work introduced me to dozens of people who'd survived similar family dynamics, adult children who treated elderly parents as ATMs, spouses who used emotional manipulation to control finances, relatives who isolated and exploited vulnerable family members. Hearing their stories helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't unique or personal but part of a widespread pattern of elder abuse that's often invisible because it happens within families. Spring returned to New York with unusual warmth and early blooms in the rooftop garden. Mrs. Patel and I planned our most ambitious gardening season yet, with tomatoes and peppers and herbs that would provide food for both our households throughout the summer. The physical act of planting seeds and nurturing them into healthy plants felt symbolic of the new life I was creating for myself. I also started planning a trip to Italy, something I'd dreamed about for years but had never felt able to afford or justify. With my financial situation stabilized and my family obligations eliminated, I had both the resources and the freedom to travel. Mrs. Patel was planning to join me for part of the trip, and we spent hours researching museums and restaurants and small towns where we could explore at our own pace. That trip, scheduled for late summer, would be the first major adventure I'd taken since Robert died. For almost 20 years, I'd lived a constrained life focused on family obligations and financial anxiety. Now, at 74, I was finally free to explore the world and pursue experiences that brought me joy rather than just fulfilling other people's expectations. The anniversary of the fire came and went without any contact from Alex or Claire. Part of me had wondered if the date might prompt them to reach out, to attempt some kind of reconciliation or at least acknowledgement of what had happened. But their silence confirmed what I'd already come to understand. they weren't interested in accountability or genuine relationship repair. They wanted restoration of the previous dynamic where I provided resources without receiving respect. I marked the anniversary privately, sitting in my apartment with a glass of wine and reflecting on how much my life had changed in the past year. The woman who'd been desperate for family approval and terrified of abandonment had been replaced by someone who valued her own peace and dignity above all else. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick, but it had been profound and lasting. As I wrote this story, almost 2 years after the fire and more than a year after ending contact with my family, I'm living the most authentic and joyful life I've ever experienced. My days are filled with activities I choose, relationships I value, and goals that emerge from my own interests rather than other people's needs. I wake up excited about photography projects, garden planning, travel preparation, and volunteer commitments. I still think about Alex and Emma sometimes, still hope that they're both finding their way toward healthier, happier lives. But I think about them with the kind of distant affection you might feel for characters in a book you read years ago, people you once cared deeply about but who no longer have any real connection to your daily existence. The sharp pain of their absence has faded into something more like nostalgic melancholy for what might have been under different circumstances. Mrs. Patel often says that our lives have seasons, and that recognizing when one season is ending allows us to fully embrace the next one. My season as the accommodating mother and grandmother who sacrificed everything for family harmony is over. My current season is about reclaiming my own identity, pursuing my own interests, and building relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation or manipulation. The most surprising discovery of this new season is how much energy I'd been spending on managing other people's emotions and problems. Without that constant drain, I have reserves of enthusiasm and creativity that I'd forgotten I possessed. My photography has improved dramatically as I've learned to see with my own eyes rather than trying to capture what I think other people want to see. My friendships have deepened as I've become more authentic and less performative in my social interactions. I've also learned to recognize and trust my own instincts in ways I never could when I was constantly second-guessing myself to avoid family conflict. The woman who spent years wondering if she was being too sensitive or unreasonable has been replaced by someone who knows her own worth and doesn't need external validation to feel secure in her decisions. This doesn't mean I've become hard or cynical. I still believe in the importance of family relationships and the value of generosity and service to others. But I now understand that healthy relationships require mutual respect and reciprocity. Love that demands self-destruction isn't really love at all, it's dependency disguised as affection, manipulation disguised as need. The Italy trip exceeded all my expectations. Mrs. Patel and I spent 3 weeks exploring Rome, Florence, and the Tuscan countryside, taking hundreds of photographs and eating amazing food and meeting fascinating people from around the world. I felt like a young person again, curious and adventurous and open to new experiences. The woman who'd been afraid to make decisions without family input was wandering through medieval towns with confidence and delight. On the last night of our trip, sitting on the terrace of a small restaurant in Siena with a glass of local wine and a view of the ancient city spread out below us, I realized that I'd finally found the life I'd been searching for. Not perfect or free from challenges, but authentic and satisfying in ways I'd never experienced before. I was no longer living someone else's idea of what my life should look like. I was living my own life, finally and fully. Coming home to New York felt like returning to a sanctuary rather than a prison. My apartment welcomed me with familiar comfort, my routines provided structure without constraint, and my friendships offered connection without drama. I'd created everything I'd always wanted: security, peace, meaningful relationships, and the freedom to pursue my own interests without judgment or interference. Have you ever lived through something similar to what I'm sharing with you today? Have you found yourself giving and giving until there was nothing left of yourself, only to discover that the people you were sacrificing for took your generosity for granted? Have you ever had to choose between maintaining family relationships and protecting your own well-being? I know these questions might stir up difficult emotions if you're dealing with your own version of family exploitation or emotional abuse. If my story sounds familiar, I want you to know that change is possible, even when it feels impossible. Even when you're afraid of ending up alone, even when guilt and obligation feel stronger than self-preservation, even when you can't imagine life without the family members who've been treating you poorly. The path I took isn't the only path, and it might not be the right path for your situation. But whatever path you choose, please remember that you deserve to be treated with respect and kindness, especially by the people who claim to love you. You deserve relationships that give you energy rather than draining it away. You deserve to feel valued for who you are, not just what you can provide for others. If watching this video has made you think about your own relationships and boundaries, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find the courage to make necessary changes in their own life. And if this message resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Sharing these difficult truths helps them reach other people who might need to hear that they're not alone in their struggles. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for opening your heart to the possibility that life can be different, better, more authentic than you might have believed possible. And remember, sometimes, to find yourself, you have to be willing to lose everything else first. Sometimes, that loss is actually the greatest gift you can give yourself.